I come from a family of writers. My mother and father were both writers. My father published 250 Western novels over the years. He was a poet before that. My mother published many novels and short pieces. And I grew up in a house with typing. There was a typewriter thundering away all the time. Nonetheless, I got into writing through other people. I briefly after I got out of graduate school, had a job, very short time on a magazine, and a friend of mine, a fellow I met, a wonderful writer named Larry Block, Lawrence Block, said to me, "You should be a writer." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, you look like a writer." So I went home, I started typing, and next time I saw Larry, I said, "You're right, I've started writing." I quit my job, and he turned absolutely pale. But he very kindly took my first efforts to his agent. And after a while, my agent, or his agent, said, "Oh, I like this one, but it's not something I understand. It's comedy. Would you mind," he asked me, "would you mind if I showed it to Donald E. Westlake?" And Don Westlake was sadly just passed on, the leading comic mystery man in the world, and he kindly sat down, read my comic novel, and so I had this as a mentor on top of Larry Block. And I was also very lucky at the same time, Brian Garfield, the president of the Western Writers at the time, youngest one ever, was part of that triumvirate of those three guys. They created a sense of quality. And to this day, if I'm suspicious about a sentence, I will think to myself, well, would Don think? What would Larry think about this? What would Brian think? So with their kind support, I kept on typing and finally came up with my first novel, Many Happy Returns. And it was actually nominated for Best First Novel by Mystery Writers of America. And I wrote some more mysteries, comic mysteries. And around that same time, I met another good friend in that crowd, Mr. Robert Ludlum. Now, Bob was just starting out. He had had his first couple of bestsellers. And I think what Bob did for me is he made me think I can do bigger books. I can try for the larger. And I came up with a bigger book, The Ship Killer. And that kind of transformed my writing life. After The Ship Killer, I was known as a big book writer and treated accordingly. And there's a new book coming out called Thriller 100 Must Reads. It's one of the must reads, and I'm kind of proud of that. After a bunch of thrillers, I went back to mysteries, and I started the Ben Abbott series. Hardscape being the first one, wrote them for a while, and then I entered a new and strange life as a pen name writer. I changed my name to Paul Garrison and published Fire and Ice. And for a number of years after that, I published only Paul Garrison novels until good friends of mine thought I had died. And eventually started writing mysteries again, and then one day got a call from Mr. Clive Cussler. And I was asked, would you like to consider collaborating with Clive on a new project? He's just published a new book, different completely than anything he's ever written, called The Chase. And I had seen the ads. It had just come out, ran to the store, read it, loved it. I was very touched by several things. One, that having written a whole bunch of sea stories, that the man suddenly decided to change and try a Western. I liked the character very much. I liked he had set it up, he was thinking like a thriller writer. He had set it up so it could go anywhere. It can move all around in America. It was set in 1906. I happened to be working in that period myself at the time. I was researching for a novel I wanted to do about Hollywood, and I was learning the period, and I loved the period, very exciting period, a whole new century and a whole new world. So I said, yeah, I'd be interested. And they said, well, could you show us a sample of your writing? So I sent a Paul Garrison novel, and I sent a Justin Scott novel. And then Clive wrote back and he said, hey, wait a minute. I endorse these books. My name's on the jacket. I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, it slipped my mind, but perhaps you did. And he apparently thought that was nice. But then the big question came up. Could Justin write in the voice of the Chase? And I told my agent, I said, are you kidding me? My father published 250 pulp westerns. I know a pulp western when I see one. It was the first thing I ever read in my life. I practically read 20 or 30 of them before I ever saw another book. And I said, yes, I am quite sure I could do that. And this got back to Clive, I'm told, and Clive was tickled pink because Clive had deliberately, it turned out, set up to do the chase in the voice of a pulp western novel. So we began to work on the next book in Clive's series, which is called The Wrecker. I know that readers are fascinated by the idea of collaboration, and I'm very often asked, what is it like to subordinate, as it were, your style to Clive Cussler's style? And I'm always a little surprised by the question, because a writer subordinates his style to each of his books. We write for the book, not for our own particular name. What Clive has written in The Chase is not what he would write in Raise the Titanic, for instance. And for that same reason, what I'm writing with Clive in The Wrecker is serving the mood and voice that Clive created in The Chase. I'm not copying Clive, I'm copying the concept of these novels, a series of novels about a detective in the American West named Isaac Bell. Isaac Bell's voice is what's important. The voice of his boss, Joseph Van Dorn, is important. The voice of his beautiful fiancée, Marion Morgan, is important. And that's the goal, and that's Clive's goal also. As you can see, in my office, I have not one but two computer screens. This is thanks to my wife, who is our technology expert, since upstairs she is editing entire films. Two screens is quite simple to her, and she set it up for me this way, and I'll tell you what is so perfectly marvelous about it. In the old days, when one typed novels, one gathered one's research around, one had one's typewriter, and around you a whole pile of books and notes and all. The novel you were writing sat in the typewriter, and you would type, and there it was on a sheet of paper. And here was a book you were working on, you'd go over here and you would look at it, or here was a picture and you'd look at it, and then you'd go back and type more. The book always stayed there. Thanks to Amber setting me up with two screens, the book always stays here. It never leaves that screen, and it's the only thing on that screen. So I can absolutely lose myself in the novel, and then if I have to know something, I go to this screen, and then I can ask questions. What did that word mean? Did I want that? I don't like the word I just used. I want something better. But I haven't left that. I haven't lost that book. It's alive every single moment of the day when I'm working. The Wrecker is an historical novel. It's set 100 and some years ago, and by its very nature, an historical novel requires research. I studied history. I know the period a bit. But there's a difference between knowing the period a bit and knowing the moments of the period that make a world real that Isaac Bell is in. The joy of research these days, as everyone knows, is Google. It is a window into millions of pieces of information gathered by everyone from scholars to hobbyists. And when you do a book about railroad trains, you discover that there are about 1,000 websites devoted to the history of railroad trains, filled with magnificent pictures, filled with articles, filled with letters, filled with reminiscences by engineers, and filled with books of the time. The other joy now of the internet is the access you have to photography. For example, Isaac Bell suddenly has a need to chase after a railroad train, and he has access to a little racing car called the Packard Gray Wolf, which was a great speedster of the early part of the century, and it set records year after year at Daytona. What is interesting is that's a really little car. Look, those people that comes up about to their waists. And then you say, well, wait a minute, what is all that copper work on the sides? There are 7 copper tubes all stacked together running the length of the car. And then you do a little more research, a little more thinking, and you think, oh my God, that's the radiator. That's how they were cooling that motor that was running so hot and fast, flying along the road. So with the time to look at a picture a while, you learn more that you can then possibly use in the scene that might make the scene, even better. Another hugely important source to me is the Oxford English Dictionary. That is the gigantic multi-volume, 20-volume unabridged dictionary of the English language. Hugely helpful when you're writing something set in an earlier period, because I can discover what words were known then and what words weren't. I can also discover how words were used then as opposed to now. And if I want to see the meaning of the word mug, let's say, I want to know when were people talking about a dumb or stupid person as a mug. I can find out, indeed, I can use it there. What's on my screen these days is something entirely different. When we finished with the final details of the Wrecker, Clive said to me, he said, maybe we should get away from locomotives for a while for the next book. And I said, well, I've been thinking about battleships. And Clive said, go for it. So, Clive and I are working with pre-World War I dreadnought battleships. It's about spies and saboteurs, and we are calling the novel The Spy. Before my father became a Western writer, and before he became a poet, he had been a civil engineer, a bridge builder, and he'd worked on the railroads. And I grew up hearing his stories, but also reading his stories. So there was a lot in the Wrecker that I kind of had in me already, and I could actually go to his books and check out certain things. He was a very vivid writer, and I could see certain key moments that would be very dramatic, in the Wrecker, and Clive and I could work on them that way. So that there was kind of a nice little connection there. So this most marvelous thing happened. Clive and I get all done with the thing, and there comes a point where, you've done your copy, edited everything, and then one day, in the mail, 2 packages arrived. The people at Putnam sent the Wrecker with that beautiful jacket, scene from the novel, of course, the train over the trestle. The other package was from my father's publisher. One of his books had been reissued. Train on a Trestle. So I think perhaps this is a collaboration that was meant to be.